Hi, welcome to the Parenting Literacy Show. The purpose of this show is to help you raise children who are healthy, intelligent, happy, spiritual, and have good social skills. My name is Dr. Joseph Lau. I'm a developmental psychologist who spent the past 41 years studying human development and the past 15 years studying parenting. Each week, I'll speak with a different expert about some aspect of child development to learn as much as we can to become the best parents we can be. Now, according to a recent study by the Commonwealth Fund, the United States spends nearly twice as much money on health care as the average of the 11 richest countries on Earth, including Australia, Canada, France, Germany, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. Despite spending so much money, we have the lowest life expectancy of all these countries, and we have the highest suicide rate of all of them. Of special concern is what's happening with America's young people. Each day in America, there's an average of over 3,000 suicide attempts by young people between the grades of 9 and 12. This comes out to more than 2 attempts per minute. According to data from the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention, from 2007 to 2017, the suicide rate among American 10 to 14-year-olds nearly tripled. And among 15 to 19-year-olds, it increased by 76%. It's gotten to the point where suicide is now the second leading cause of death for 10 to 24-year-olds in the United States. The suicide rate is also 3 to 4 times higher among boys and young men than girls and young women. Across the United States, teenagers and young adults die from suicide more often than from cancer, heart disease, AIDS, birth defects, stroke, pneumonia, influenza, and chronic lung disease put together. The New York City Department of Health has found that in 2014, more New Yorkers died from suicide than from car accidents or homicide. So it's a serious problem. In addition, the New York City Department of Health has found that the proportion of deaths by jumping from a high place among both male and female New Yorkers was about 8 times the national rate. Also, the New York City Health Department study found that between 2012 and 2014, the suicide rate in low-income neighborhoods was more than twice as high as the suicide rate in middle and high-income neighborhoods in New York. And so this is clearly something we need to be concerned about. And so here to help us better understand what's going on is Dr. Regina Miranda. Dr. Miranda is the daughter of Honduran immigrants and is a first-generation college student. She received her bachelor's degree in psychology from Yale University and her PhD in clinical psychology from New York University. She completed a postdoctoral research fellowship at the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. And since then, she's been a professor at the psychology department at Hunter College. She's also a faculty member in the doctoral program in health psychology and clinical science in the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. In addition to being a professor and a clinical psychologist, Dr. Miranda is also the director of the Laboratory for the Study of Youth Cognition and Suicide. And Dr. Miranda recently founded the Youth Suicide Research Consortium with other researchers to increase diversity in youth suicide research. Her research focuses on understanding why young people think about and attempt suicide. Finally, Dr. Miranda has published more than 50 research papers in professional journals and chapters of books and spoken at more than 100 conferences. Perhaps the easiest way to summarize her outstanding credentials is just to say that Dr. Miranda is one of America's leading experts on teen suicide. So thank you for being here, Dr. Miranda.
Thank you for having me.
So let's begin by considering what seems to be a very serious problem. It seems like America's young people are dying at rates that are alarming. What do you think is going on here?
Well, as you mentioned, suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people. It's actually not it's been receiving a lot of national attention, but that has been the case since around the time that I started doing this research back in 2005. So it's been a problem of increasing concern for many, many years that is now receiving a lot more national attention, which is great because hopefully that will lead to greater funding for youth suicide research. It's not an easy question to answer. There are a lot of different things that people have thought might be going on that might be leading to increased suicide rates. everything ranging from access to firearms to changes in social media use and screen time to substance use and depression and other mood and anxiety disorders. Access to healthcare, mental health care, and differences and changes in access to adequate treatment. So it's not really there's no one, it's a hard question to answer because there's no one right answer. And in fact, what we're finding as suicide researchers is that a lot of the typical predictors that we've been looking at over the years, clinical predictors like depression, don't necessarily help us predict whether a young person is going to die by suicide in the imminent future, or whether they're at imminent risk of death by suicide. So there are a lot of unanswered questions that researchers like myself are trying to study. We also, I think, tend to focus on the study of suicide at the level of the individual, so looking at the psychology behind risk, and we tend to ignore systemic factors that may also contribute. So I think there's a lot of progress being made, but there's still a lot that we don't know, and every time a study comes out, another study comes out that says something different.
Okay.
And so, so there's a lot of different factors that impact risk and that may impact these trends.
It seems like a lot of parents would like to know, what is it that causes suicide? And what you seem to be saying is that there's not a simple answer because there's so many different moving parts involved.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we can look at some of the different factors that are maybe predictors or warning signs that parents can look for that maybe can be a signal that they should at least be on the alert. So you mentioned a bunch of them, and we probably don't have time to go through all of them, but let's think about a few of them. So for example, you mentioned firearms. Why should parents be concerned about firearms, especially in America where we have a constitutional right to have firearms?
Well, more generally, deaths by suicide tend to most often happen by firearm. And that's one possible reason that we see the difference in suicide rates by gender. So as you mentioned, men and boys tend to die by suicide more often than women and girls. But we also know that in terms of thinking about suicide and attempting suicide, girls report higher rates of having thoughts about suicide, of suicidal ideation, whereas and girls also attempt suicide at higher rates than do boys. And so one possible reason for that disparity is that there's greater access. It's the method that girls versus boys use to attempt suicide. So although the trends have been differing in the past several years, boys who die by suicide or men who die by suicide tend to more often die via firearm. It's a more lethal method. And girls who attempt suicide tend to do so more by overdose. But although there was one year, a few years ago, where the rates of firearm deaths, it was about equal, where firearms were the leading cause of suicide deaths among both boys and girls, but or women versus men. But generally, deaths by suicide tend to most often happen. The leading method is firearms.
Wow. So if we could eradicate firearms or easy access to them, it sounds like we might reduce the suicide rate almost overnight.
That's what people who advocate for gun control legislation would suggest, that one way to reduce suicide rates is to restrict access to firearms, although those who criticize that potential method of intervention would suggest that, well, if you restrict access to firearms, people may substitute with other methods. But of developed countries, we saw data, international data suggesting that in other developed countries, where suicide rates were going down, in the United States that wasn't the case. And so one potential reason might be access to firearms.
It seems that if you try to kill yourself using, say, an overdose of a drug, then there is a greater chance of being saved. Right? So, for example, somebody might take an overdose and call their best friend and say, guess what I just did? Right? And their best friend then can intervene. But if they pick up a gun and use that, then you don't have as much of an opportunity to be safe.
Yeah, it's a more lethal method.
Interesting. Now, there are a lot of other factors that you mentioned, and again, we can't go through all of them, but what about something like social media? That's something that has become a greater issue in the last few years. Children have more access to that, and they have access to it at younger and younger ages. So that we find that it's something where maybe even 10-year-olds now are getting access to social media. Does that play a role in the increase in suicide rate we found in the United States?
I wish I could give you a yes/no answer to that question, but that's one of another area where we need increasing research. And I get asked that question about social media a lot, and it's not a clear answer. So there has been some research that has looked at trends in suicide rates and also trends in social media use and screen use, and use of digital devices, that has suggested that the increase in suicide rates also corresponded with increases in use of digital devices and social media, increased social media use. But then there's also been some research that contradicts some of those findings. So it's not clear, based on some of the research that we're starting to do in my lab, that one of my doctoral students is doing, and also just looking at the contradictory evidence, there's also other evidence that suggests that social media use is not related to things like depression. There was a longitudinal study that recently came out that suggested that there was no relationship. It's likely that you get from social media partly what you bring into it, so that it's possible that for those who are more resilient or who have better social skills, that social media, or already have social networks established, social media use may enhance those networks. And for those who maybe are more socially isolated or have more other maybe cognitive biases, or are already suffering, that social media use, we don't know from the data, but it may be more maladaptive. So I think it's unclear. There are probably a lot of individual differences that go into what the effects of social media are on each individual and each individual child. Of course, parents should be monitoring kids' social media use, and with my own kids, my kids don't have social media, don't use social media. Although my middle school daughter does have a cell phone, but I would recommend that parents monitor, and maybe in the earlier ages until maybe high school, restrict social media use.
Well, it sounds like you're saying that even though there's a correlation between the use of social media and attempts to kill oneself, that apparent relationship may really be due to something else. That there may be these other factors, like maybe predisposing conditions or maybe being depressed, that are relevant.
Well, that's one possibility. So if someone's already depressed and using social media, again, we don't have enough data to suggest that. There's some data that suggests that how you use social media may affect how you feel. So people who engage more actively in social media use, so they're actually making comments and interacting with people, may get more benefits than people who are just scrolling and maybe viewing content and engaging in social comparison to others. This is, again, data from one of my doctoral students that is doing. But we don't have enough information yet. We have more studies that need to be done. But that's some of our working hypotheses are that you get from social media partly what you bring into it. Another potential factor is, thinking about what happens to our ways of interacting with people with the introduction of social media. So it may not be social media use, but it may be what that reflects about how we engage with each other interpersonally, and how much we're actually connecting with people in personally versus via text message or via WhatsApp or social media. So what does that do to our ability to engage over difficult topics, or talk about our feelings to each other, or be able to tell when someone's in distress?
That's an interesting issue because social media is a relatively new phenomenon. So part of the reality is that we naturally have concerns about it, but there are also advantages and disadvantages. So we want to be careful not to say that social media is all bad, but as psychologists, that we have, I think, a responsibility to examine both the good and bad. And in this case, when we're looking at teen suicide, given that there seems to be a correlation there, it seems very important to examine that more carefully and get a better idea of what's going on.
Yeah.
But it also seems like because it's so new, there's still a lot of different ways of looking at it, and maybe each different way you look at it is going to produce a different result.
Right.
And so that seems to complicate things. So we don't have the simple answers we're hoping for yet, at least.
Yeah, I don't want to blame social media use for increased suicide rates because we really don't have enough data yet to draw that conclusion.
Okay, good point. But what about something like bullying? We know that there's bullying on social media, but also there's bullying in non-social media, in everyday life. Does that play a role in teen suicides?
I think to the degree, we know that bullying increases risk of suicidal thoughts, suicidal behavior, and suicide deaths. So there is a relationship. That's again another area where we need more research to look at what some of those mechanisms are. And so one potential mechanism that has been studied is the degree to which bullying decreases a person's feelings of belonging or feeling of being integrated. So there's one very popular contemporary model of suicide by Thomas Joyner that suggests that people think about suicide because they either perceive themselves to be a burden to others or that they don't feel that they belong, that they have a low belongingness or thwarted belongingness. And so that having those two things having one of those things leads people to have more passive suicidal thoughts, but having both of those things leads people to have more active suicidal thoughts. And so when you combine that with someone who has a life history or has engaged in behaviors that have gotten them used to the experience of self-harm, that those two things can combine to lead someone to make a lethal suicide attempt. And so to the degree that bullying may decrease a person's sense of belonging, that could be one mechanism that could contribute to risk. But again, it's one of those other situations where I don't want to say increases in bullying is one reason that we see increased suicide rates, because I think these trends have been going up since I've been doing this research. When I started doing this research, was around the time that suicide rates among young people were increasing for the first time in a while in the United States.
So are you saying the incidence of bullying is increasing as well? If there's some kind of insecurity among families or teenagers that wasn't there before, I could see how that might contribute to an increase in bullying and that, maybe with the consequences that come from that.
We do know that not just bullying, but other adverse experiences and interpersonal problems. So in some of the work that we do, we find that among young people, many of the precipitants of suicide attempts tend to be interpersonal. And I think other literature with adults and young people suggests that as well. So often when you talk to people who've attempted suicide and ask them about what led them to think about or attempt suicide, many of the things that report tend to be interpersonal or having to do with relationships with other people or a loss of a relationship or a conflict or difficulty navigating a romantic relationship, for example, or family relationship. So with the teenagers that we see in our research, those tend to be either family related or relationship, such as a friendship or a romantic relationship.
I had a student, a college student many years ago, who had been engaged, and she found out that her fiancé was cheating on her, and they broke up apparently in a very nasty way. And she then tried to kill herself.
Okay.
Fortunately, she didn't succeed. But could you tell me more about how this interpersonal relationship plays a role? 'Cause it sounds like it's a very, very important part of the whole dynamic.
Well, I think the need to belong is fundamental to our lives and to our relationships with other people. Human beings, we're relational, and so we need relationships, and relationships. Both early family relationships and our relationships that we develop throughout our lives help us develop our self-views and our views of other people. And so navigating those relationships is fundamental, I think, to our human experiences.
That makes sense, especially if you're talking about a relationship with somebody who's very close to you as opposed to just a distant friend.
Yeah.
But all of us have gone through experiences as children, adolescents, where we go into a romantic relationship and it doesn't work out. It's part of the growing pains that we all go through. But most adolescents don't commit suicide over it. So what are some of the other factors that you think might cause one adolescent to commit suicide under those conditions when others don't?
So I want to just interject and say that we tend to use the term, we don't use the term commit suicide anymore.
Yes.
So to die by suicide or to attempt suicide or make a suicide attempt. Or, so your question is, what are some of the factors that might distinguish whether someone who, say, has a negative life event occur, like the breakup of a romantic relationship,
Yes.
what might lead them to go on and die by suicide versus someone else?
Yes.
That again is the important question, and so there's no one right or wrong answer. The problem is that we don't really know as researchers, so we don't have the definitive answer. We have theories.
Okay.
So one theory, which I talked about earlier, suggests that it's a degree to which someone has already acquired that capability. So someone who already has, say, a history of engaging in self-harm.
Okay.
So we know that things like non-suicidal self-injury or having a previous history of suicide attempts may habituate the person to not fearing death, not fearing the pain involved in suicide death. Okay. Or having engaged in other risky behaviors that habituate them to self-harm, or even things like having a history of abuse, physical or sexual abuse, that may habituate the person to the experience of self-harm.
Wow.
At least according to these theories, we still need more data to test these theories. Other theories suggest that it's there's this one theory called the Ideation to Action framework, which was developed by David Klonsky, which suggests that it's you're looking at the balance between connectedness and suicidal desire. And so when you have high suicidal desire and low connectedness, and plus the acquired capability that leads you to transition from thinking about to attempting suicide. So many of these theories look at interpersonal relationships or feelings of connectedness, or whether you feel like you belong versus being a burden to others, versus the degree to which you have a life history that has allowed you to acquire that capability for suicide. But those are theories, but it's not an answer, a clear-cut answer. So we still, there have been some researchers that have looked at groups of studies that have been done over the past several decades, which have concluded that using our traditional predictors of suicide, like depression or substance use or even family history or other things that you might think would predict imminent risk of suicide, we're really no better than chance at telling whether someone's at risk of dying by suicide in the short term. We're better at telling in the long term, but not in the short term. And it's similar with kids. Our traditional clinical predictors have not been good at telling us whether someone's at imminent risk of suicide. So we have a lot more work to do.
So what is a parent to do? What kinds of signs should parents look for that might be a warning that they should be more careful, maybe study the child more carefully?
Well, first, I think parents need to start the conversation. I think what happens nationally is also reflected in what happens in the home. So to the degree that we feel comfortable talking about topics like suicide, I think will be reflected in the degree, as a country, will also be reflected in the degree to which parents may feel comfortable broaching the topic. And so I think first parents need to open up the conversation about mental health and about suicide. So you can look for warning signs like increased social isolation, talking about feeling like a burden, or expressing hopelessness about the future, talking about not feeling like one belongs. Maybe in children, depression, signs of depression may not be reflected in saying that you're sad. It might be talking about, it may be being irritable or mad. And another symptom of depression, like not being interested, kind of withdrawing and not being interested in doing the things that you're usually interested in doing, or activities that you usually enjoy, that might be reflected in saying things like, I'm bored. Sometimes we tend to talk about depression in kids the way that we might in adults, but it might look different in kids. It might also manifest itself more behaviorally with somatic problems, or maybe oppositional behavior, or even aggression. I think all of these types of things are important things to look for, but also feeling comfortable having the conversations about what are things that make you sad. Do you ever feel so sad that you wish that you weren't here, that you weren't around, that you have, or talking about what they know about suicide, we know that there's some literature on things like suicide clusters, or suicides that happen when one suicide happens, other suicides among people that knew that individual or in that particular area. How the suicide of a peer might affect, or a family member even, might affect the teen or the child's own thoughts about suicide.
Wow, there's so much. We could easily talk about this for another hour. You've been very informative. If somebody feels that their child is at risk of suicide, and they feel uncomfortable talking with the child, they could always try calling the New York Suicide Prevention Hotline. The phone number for that is 212-673-3000. There's also a national hotline that it would be 800-273-8255. Now, Dr. Miranda, if somebody would like to get more information about your work or just suicide, is there a place where they could do this?
Sure. You could go to www.mirandalab.org, and if you'd like to know more about the Youth Suicide Research Consortium, you can go to www.youthsuicideresearch.org.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for sharing what you've learned with us.
Thank you.
So we hope that this show is informative and that you'll find something in here that can help you be a better parent. Thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next week.